tonight we have the author, Hendrik Booraem, who's here to talk about his book, Young Jerry Ford. And those of you who have already seen it and read it, he probably shares some of our enthusiasm about this book just because it's so rich with Grand Rapids history. And I think what he's done with the 1920s and 30s and just kind of captured that so beautifully in this book. Lots of good Grand Rapids history, but also a really interesting approach to biography where you are only talking about the person's early life and very much kind of, well, he can talk more about this, but how character is created in those early years and how his life and growing up in Grand Rapids led him to be the kind of leader that he was. So please welcome Hendrik Booraem. He's going to talk. There will be an opportunity to ask questions if you want to. And then after his talk, he'll come inside the store. I'll be happy to sign books for you. And we have refreshments in there for you as
well. I've been writing books about presidents now for about 20, 25 years. They're always the same thing. The first 20, 22, 23 years of a man's life. And this, however, is the first one that I've written that doesn't have a lot of footnotes and bibliography and all the scholarly stuff. The reason I did it this way was that the Gerald Ford Museum downtown was doing a centennial exhibition because Ford was born 100 years ago next month, July 14th, is going to be his centennial. And they wanted a book to put out to coincide with the exhibition that they were putting on, Growing Up Grand, which if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a trip down there to have a look. They've done just a fine job and have really interesting stuff there. So I said, yeah, it would be fun to write a book that didn't have a lot of footnotes and that had a lot of pictures instead. So I went over to the Grand Rapids Public Library, asked them to dig in their excellent photograph file, and got a lot of stuff from the library in Ann Arbor, and looked around in different places. And so here it is, Young Jerry Ford, which does basically two things, and the same two things that I try to do in all my books. Number one, try to figure out how did this child become an adult. What behavior patterns, what beliefs, what interests did he pick up on his way to adulthood, and what kind of man did that make him? And number two, what was it like being a child in those years? What were the things that you saw? What was just daily life like? Where what did you have to drink and where did you get it? Where did you get your reading matter? What did you do after dark? Stuff like that. Well, for the 1920s and 30s, it's not as different as it would be for, like, Andrew Jackson. I've done a book on Andrew Jackson's early life during the Revolution, and that was very different. So I thought I'd be happy to talk at length about the second part about life in the 20s and 30s, and there's a lot of it in the book. But I think tonight I'm going to talk about mainly the first part, which is how did Ford become the kind of person that he was? That is, a man fit to be president, with really remarkable personal values. Everybody who met him agreed. Just presidents are not always good people. You can be a good president without being a good person. Ford is one of the few that was a good president and a good person. So how did he get there? The early part of his life was very unpromising. His mother and his father separated 2 weeks after he was born. She literally fled from the house in Omaha, Nebraska with her baby in her arms, and went across the river to Council Bluffs, Iowa, met her parents, got on the train to Chicago, and to start a new life. Why did she do that? Because she was scared of her husband. He had this violent, uncontrollable temper, that where he would just pick up the nearest thing and threaten her with it. He had done nothing worse to her than slap her up at this point. She had hung on for the sake of the child that she expected. But finally, after the child was born and it didn't make things get any better, he was threatening her with a butcher knife, threatening the nurse who was attending her. She decided it was time to get out. So that's certainly strike one. I mean, you can say a two-week-old child is too young to remember anything, but at some level this has got to leave scars. I mean, Little Junior, this is what she called him. She named him for his father, Leslie King, but she didn't want to call him Leslie. She just called him Junior. He was Junior to her all his life. Little Junior obviously grew up in a house. His first few years were a house without a man. He had lots of love from his mother, but it was still rough. So that's one thing. And she gets to Grand Rapids. Why did she get to Grand Rapids when she went to Chicago? Because her father, who was from a small town outside Chicago, was in real estate. He was selling properties in Grand Rapids and Toledo, both of which were growing rapidly at that time. And he had just picked up a property down on Terrace Street, down near Garfield Park. So she came there to live, and almost immediately he got sick with Bright's disease and died very shortly. That's another sad story. But she met a young man, steady, whom she liked. Her mother didn't approve of him because he came from a poorer family than the Gardner, so her name was Gardner. His name was Jerry Ford. He was a salesman for a paint and wallpaper company. He just become manager of the paint department. And so she thought they fell in love and got married. Okay, so there's a little tension there. Her mother never approved of it. Fortunately, her mother eventually got out of the picture and went to live with another sister, and so there wasn't too much tension there. But then, number one, little Junior, 5 years old, starts showing signs of the same ungovernable temper that his birth parent has. At kindergarten, he shoves other kids through the door. He just gets furious. His face turns red. So obviously, here's a problem. And then finally, in 1922, they're reorganizing the paint and wallpaper company, and the family has just bought a new house just over the East Grand Rapids line, and Jerry Ford loses his job. So they have to give up the house and move back to a rental property in Union Avenue, which wasn't the kind of neighborhood that it is now, but it was not a super neighborhood. It was kind of mixed. So this is unpromising beginning. Now, how did they overcome this, and how did Ford come to be the sort of man that he was? Number one, of course, his mother really deserves, 90% of credit. She was just amazing. She went to work on getting him to control his temper in a number of ways. She would put him in front of a mirror and show him how silly he looked when he got red in the face and he screamed. She made him memorize Bible verses. He that mastereth his temper is greater than he that conquereth the city. That's from Proverbs. She got him to learn her poem by heart. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, and so forth. And gradually, little by little, and it was a very slow process because he had trouble with his temper into early adulthood. In New York, one time he put his fist through a glass door of a nightclub when he got annoyed with a woman he was dating. But it was slow, but it worked. Competitive sports also made a big difference, frankly. I mean, we talk about what Jerry Ford did for football, but what football did for Jerry Ford. When he got into it, he found out that one of the strategies that the team uses against you is to try to get you to lose your temper so that you'll lose control over your play. That obviously made a big difference. So that was number one. Number two, she sat him down, and I mean, just like the super mom, she just sat with him like 2 hours every night, making sure that he studied everything. She supervised all his schoolwork, she didn't do any of it for him, but she made sure that he stayed on the job. The result of that was that he developed just remarkably good study habits. He ended up having 3 little half-brothers, and they all lived in the same room because it was not a big house. They all slept in the same room. So if you can imagine him trying to do his work with 3 little brothers carrying on, but he did. He had this great ability to focus and this real dedication to study habits. He was not a gifted student, but you don't have to be gifted if you have good study habits, frankly. I mean, what really pays off is just applying yourself over and over again. If you're really talented, if you have a real zest for the material, that's one reason to apply yourself over and over again. But if you can do it even when you don't like it, that's even better in some ways. So that was a great gift that his mother gave him. She also insisted on things that were important then. I'm not sure how important they are now, but ballroom dancing, for instance. He had to learn it. Fortunately, Jerry Ford's younger sister had a dance studio uptown across from the family. So he went up there once a week and learned to dance. He learned how to write thank you letters. Even if you don't want to, you just sit down and do it. This is how you start a thank you letter, and this is how you end it. It's just amazing. His mother drilled all this stuff into him. Well, at the same time, his father was a huge example, too. When his father lost his job in 1922 and had to give up the house, he just said, well, I guess I'll just have to work harder. He took a job as a salesman for another company. That was in 1922 with the aid of friends that he had through the Masons. He was a Mason. He ended up getting such confidence that he and his boss on the new job ended up starting a new business of their own. There was an old concrete block company in the north side of town. They made it into a paint department for the business. Jerry would do the selling, and they brought in a scientist to do the paint manufacture. And it ended up right at the end of the 20s being the Ford Paint and Varnish Company. He became boss of his own business. But, his stepfather did something even more important for Jerry. And that was at the table every night he talked about community problems, Grand Rapids problems. What can be done about poverty, what can be done about crime in different parts of town, just different problems and how they can be dealt with, and politics, for that matter. And Ford listened, and this is undoubtedly why he went into politics. He grew up thinking that stuff was important because he heard his dad talking about it. His father was not much of a reader. He didn't have time to. He was on the road all the time selling stuff. And I should say, because Jerry Ford Sr. was on the road all the time, and Mrs. Ford had weight problems and was off and on in the hospital or not feeling too good, Jerry ended up changing the diapers on most of the younger brothers. So he said at one time he thought he had probably changed more diapers than his mother had. But in any event, His dad did not read too much, but he did insist that Jerry read the Horatio Alger books. Now, y'all have probably heard these. You know, the poor boy becomes rich, you know, because he saves the boss's daughter's life or something, and he marries her, and all this kind of stuff. The moral of the Horatio Alger books wasn't that a poor boy can become rich. The moral was that a poor boy can become rich and still preserve his moral values. Yeah. Everybody understood you could get a lot of money overnight, but it usually would destroy you because people, having a lot of money makes people forget their values. That was what Jerry's father was concerned about, not only making money, but also keeping your values up. And that leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is just simply that Jerry was lucky that he grew up in Grand Rapids, because as a community, it also had very strong values about social organization and helping people. Jerry Ford Sr. founded a thing called Youth Commonwealth, which was in the poor sections of town, which at that point was down the Light South Division Avenue. It was providing a club where poor kids could get together and they would have a club. They'd elect officers and go by the rules of democracy and stuff like that. His father believed very strongly in the importance of rules. All the Ford boys were taught tell the truth, always do your best work, and come to dinner on time. You don't have to do anything else. So Grand Rapids was a community that supported a lot of progressive groups like that, the YMCA, the Boy Scouts, which were so big in Jerry's life. He was in Troop 15. He was just, he ate, slept, and drank the Boy Scouts for like 4 years. He ended up earning 26 merit badges. His first merit badge was in cooking. That was no problem because he cooked a lot at home anyhow when his mother was sick. He did more cooking than most presidents did. As you know, he had a job at a hamburger shack across from the high school when he was a junior. He flipped a lot of burgers, and then he put himself through college being the cook and waiter at a fraternity house. So it was, he used those cooking skills a lot. That was his first merit badge. You can see a list of all of them. There's a nice little book about Jerry Ford's scouting years, written by a local man around here. So the Y to which he belonged, that's where he learned to swim, the Boy Scouts, his father's Youth Commonwealth, the Masons, of course, were, he didn't belong to the DeMolay because the DeMolay and the Scouts had kind of an arrangement where you belonged to one or the other. So you can just say that he was, I'm not trying to flatter local pride or anything like that, but it just it provided a good set of values for a kid to learn growing up. And this is what he internalized and said basically, playing by the rules has done a lot for me and with Boy Scouts and competitive sports in my own life. I'd like to teach others to do it, and I think this is why he wanted to become a lawyer, basically. A lawyer is a person to make sure that people do what they're supposed to do. So I'll just mention one other thing. He did have his share of luck. It was luck, for instance, that the house that they lived in Union Avenue was right at the dividing line between the Central High School Attendance District and the South High School Attendance District. So he could have gone to either. His father talked to an old friend who was the basketball coach at Central, who said, send Jerry to South, because he'll learn more about life that way. He'll mix with a greater variety of people. And that certainly worked out well for Jerry. He became a class leader at South, where he might well have been lost in the shuffle at Central, where there were a lot of old, wealthy, privileged families around. as everybody knows, he became a football hero in his sophomore year at high school. How did he do that? This really was luck. He was the backup center on the football team. Right at the beginning of the season, the starting center had an injury and didn't play for the rest of the season. This moved forward into the slot, and he ended up being center for the whole basketball season because, for a variety of reasons, none of the other, South won the city championship that year, and none of the other centers did particularly well, so the Grand Rapids Herald at the end of the football season named him the outstanding center for the whole city during the year. He did a good job, but having the opportunity to do the good job was total coincidence. It got him started on a path that made him commit his life to athletics. This is the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop. He committed his life to athletics for about the next 10 years, and I think probably he came this close to going into athletics and becoming a professional coach. He really liked the idea of coaching, of getting, it kind of fit in with his beliefs too, getting people to play correctly by the rules. He was an assistant football coach at Yale for 4 or 5 years and found it very satisfying. I often compare his career to that of Bud Wilkinson, who came from the same kind of family in Minneapolis, had to make the same kind of decisions. And in both cases, the father, Mr. Wilkinson and Mr. Ford, objected violently to his son going into athletics because the profession at that time had no prestige. It was kind of a seedy sort of entertainer's job, and in the case of Jerry Ford, his father convinced him. He went back into law. In the case of Wilkinson, he stayed in athletics and became a legend in Oklahoma. So, 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, in my view, but certainly Grand Rapids was fortunate to have a president rather than even an outstanding college football player. So that really is what I have to say, but I'd love to answer any questions you may have on the board's life. Yeah.
Where did you get all this information from?
How did I learn so much about it? There were a lot of articles written about him when he became president, because he wasn't one of these people who had been running for president forever. He sort of came out of left field because he had only been vice president for a year, and before that he had been just a congressman from the Michigan 5th District. Everybody wanted to know about him, so there were lots of magazine articles. Some of them were friendly, some of them were not particularly friendly. A lot of people remembered President Johnson's comment that Ford played football too long without a helmet. In other words, that he was dumb. He wasn't dumb, but he was inarticulate. There's a difference there. Because of the emotional trauma that he had, he stuttered a lot. In childhood, he overcame that, but he never got to be a real fluent speaker. When he opened his mouth, he was never quite sure what was going to come out. And so that's one reason. But so you have like half a dozen articles and 3 biographies right at the beginning. Then after that, I went over to Ann Arbor where the Gerald Ford Library is. They have all his manuscripts, all the articles collected and stuff like that. I read all those, talked to his brother who still lives in Grand Rapids, Dick Ford, who's one of the younger half-brothers. And of course there are many other little tools, but that's a short answer.
Reunion as well, I think.
Sorry?
That reunion that you went to?
Oh yes, that's right. That was real important. That was the first thing I did actually. Was I went to a reunion of the class of 1931 of South High School, I had talked to a couple of people before. They had invited me to come to the reunion. I asked them to give their memories of Jerry, or Junie, as he was also called. That was a compromise between Junior and Jerry. So Jerry or Junie, and they all were really cooperative. They just gave me all these memories of him, all the different things that had happened. The girl who remembered Jerry and his football buddies would stick out their legs and block the way for her so she couldn't get to the pencil sharpener, just kind of hassling her, so little memories like that, little memories like getting caught riding the elevator, the school elevator, which was supposed to be reserved for teachers, and then other things that, so lots of high school stuff. It was very good. Any other questions? Yeah.
How many presidents have you written biographies of altogether?
Ford is the fifth one that I've published. I've done Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, James A. Garfield, who's the easiest one to do because he kept a diary all the time he was a teenager. You can just see his life from the inside out. And Calvin Coolidge. And I've got one in Grover, Cleveland, largely done. So, yeah.
Are your other presidential biographies also just the person as a young?
They're just the early life, but they're more scholarly and don't have nearly so many pictures. They got lots and lots of footnotes, heavy documents. I don't mean to tell you don't read them because I think it's pretty interesting. But they cost more, they're hardbound and stuff like that. I'm going to bring out a book like that on Ford actually in 2 years. I've been over at Ann Arbor working on his college years. I was just talking to his fraternity, the Deeks, today, and about finding out what that was all about. Yeah.
What was it that first inspired you to want to write about the youth of presidents?
I guess I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, and of course Virginia is just dominated by Thomas Jefferson. You see statues of him everywhere and stuff like that. And I don't know, I was walking along perhaps beside a Jefferson statue or something and just thinking, what was this man really like? The man as different from the statue. How do you get to the man's real personality? Then I remember figuring, how do you find a man's personality? You go back before he became a politician. Obviously politicians have every motivation to hide and shade parts of their personality. So you try to go back before then. And yet, at a time when the personality is largely developed, so I figured probably teenage, early manhood would be the time to focus on. And so William Henry Harrison was the first one that I started on, just because his life is interesting. It was the first one I wrote, but I've had a hard time getting it published. It just got published by Kent State University last year, and I'm still real fond of it because it's my first. And then I went on to other ones. What else can I tell you? I think the chapter that I'm writing now is junior year when Ford learns to drive. We don't know anything about who taught him to drive. I assume it was his father. There was only one car in the family. I do tell the story of how Jerry becomes a high school senior and wants a car of his own, saves up a lot of summer money and buys this 1923 Ford, which one of his high school acquaintances said was not much of a car, but he was very fond of it. It had running boards, as old cars of that kind did. He would take practically the whole football team to practice, clinging to the car and riding on the running board and stuff like that. And then the legendary story, this is the kind of story the Fords love to tell about themselves, how it burned down in the driveway. When he let the engine overheat and then covered it with a blanket. No. Well, and so I'm learning a lot of stuff about driving and driving in cars in those days. I had a thrill yesterday. I was looking through a collection at the University of Michigan and saw for the first time a Michigan driver's license from the 20s, which of course is not a photo ID. It was just a little folding white card like that, stamped 1925. This guy was 16 when he got it. And actually, I think that was fairly recent that the age limit had been put in at all, because there were so few cars back then. You could drive as soon as you were old enough to sit in the driver's seat and see over the wheel, really. There was no driver instruction or anything. They would sell, this is literally true, I found this out from a diary at Ann Arbor. You could just walk into a dealer's showroom, have a discussion with the salesman, even if you had never driven before. He would show you a couple of times, and then you were out on the road on your own. It was really exciting. So I'm going to be learning about it. It was also very dangerous. The accident rate for both cars and pedestrians was just, I mean, and all the safety stuff that we have in our cars, they didn't have. It's pretty frightening. So that is the kind of stuff that I write about. Yeah.
President Ford had the opportunity to look at any of your manuscript?
Yes. Yeah, he did. I finished the first two chapters on his mother's coming to Grand Rapids and her marriage to Jerry Ford, and then a description of Grand Rapids as it was in the 1920s. And I sent them to him, I guess, about 3 years before he died. And I got a very nice letter back. He said, "Thank you for showing me these. I learned things about my family I didn't know." So, and then, of course, I was emboldened to send him a bunch of questions to answer, and I never heard back. But yeah, he did see a couple of chapters.
Now, didn't his children also say they learned some things they didn't know?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And of course, they may have stuff there. They may have stuff in boxes at the house. They haven't yet. You're talking about sources. There still may be letters and documents in the Ford house, but they just haven't had time to sort through. They'll come to the library eventually. So I have to realize I'm doing the best I can, but it may not be the final word. Something may turn up 5 or 10 years from now that's just going to completely change it. Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you.